I have to answer is low sodium diet should or should not. As you all know, there is a strong link between cardiovascular and renal outcomes and salt, because salt increase blood pressure, injured kidney, promote cardiac hypertrophy, diastolic and systolic dysfunction, and can also enhance oxidative stress, endothelial dysfunction, fibrosis. And salt is also linked to obesity, cancer, osteoporosis, and asthma crisis. As you see here, the higher the intake of salt, the higher of systolic and diastolic blood pressure. And it is also the case for salt and cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular events increase in case of increase of salt, and cardiovascular mortality also. That's why the recommendations are the following. It is advised to decrease salt consumption to less than 2.3 grams. But the truth is that we never achieve in the modern area a salt consumption of less than 3 grams, and it is not sustainable. The truth is that less than 10% of the population in the world is in the range of less than 2.3 grams of salt. And the truth also is that we don't have evidence that in taking less than 3 grams of salt per day will have a benefit in cardiovascular outcome. But as you've seen here, the guidelines are that we have to lesser salt intake at less than 5 grams per day. One of the main questions is the following. Is there a G-curve shaped relation between salt consumption and cardiovascular outcome? And as you've seen here, if you see in a general population and in the world, we will see those who are consuming between 3 or 5 grams per day, and those who have a low sodium intake. And of course, you have also high sodium intake. And you have here, on your left, the correspondency between the salt in gram and millimole, and also, because of practical purpose, how you need with teaspoon to have sodium per gram. So we will have to see the evidences of the relation between salt and cardiovascular disease, and we start with hypertension. We all know the INTERSALT study conducted in 1988. We had a just weak positive association of sodium intake in almost all the countries. The NTMAP study conducted later on didn't find an association between sodium intake and blood pressure. The PERS study, at contrary, showed that it is possible to have a positive and threshold association of sodium intake with blood pressure, as you see here in your right. But the correlation was only significant if the consumption was over 3 grams per day. And it was really strong when the consumption was more than 5 grams per day. And we have specific population for this relation. It was older people, hypertensive subjects, and those who have low amount of potassium consumption. Otherwise, it was also those who didn't have good consumption of vegetables and fruits. We can also add those with metabolic syndrome, those with obesity. And another study also confirmed that it is possible to demonstrate a positive correlation between high blood pressure and higher sodium intake. If you see what happens in the randomized trial, we have conflicting data. Usually, the studies are short-term studies, less than 6 months mainly. And in a meta-analysis, we have just a reduction, but it was attenuated over time. It means that 3 to 6 months after, you don't have a good correlation between salt and hypertension. And the other things, I mentioned it earlier, is that it's quite impossible to achieve in a population a sustainable low sodium intake, even if you have an intensive dietary counseling. The DASH sodium trial, you all know what is it. It was a feeding trial. It means that it was not only restricting of salt, but it was also a trial to promote healthy diet with fruit, vegetables, to lower saturated fats, etc. And you have 3 different levels of sodium intakes. And in this situation, the strategy to lower sodium, and in the feeding group, we have a greater decrease of blood pressure. But as I said, you have conflicting data. The top study showed very small effects. The top trial achieved also very anecdotic results despite intensive dietary counseling. And on the other hand, the Pew International study with a very big cohort showed a G-shaped association between sodium excretion and cardiovascular disease and also total mortality. It means that between 3 or 5 grams, you have an optimal result, but above you have, or less than 3 grams, you probably have adverse outcomes. The UCA Bank showed no significant association between sodium excretion and cardiovascular events. And finally, you will see that in a meta-analysis with the Cochrane collaboration shows an overall 20% lowering of cardiovascular outcomes, but nothing significant for mortality. But it was just driven by one study, and we didn't have sufficient power to confirm all the clinical important effects. Now let's see what happens for heart failure. As you know, we are all, it is classical to reduce salt for heart failure. But in the heart study, you even have a high risk of death and hospitalization for heart failure among the patients randomized to restricting sodium in salt, as you've seen here. So it means that it is not a game over to reduce salt in heart failure. The benefit is not as strong as we thought. And some specific populations didn't have a good outcome. And as you see, after 2 years of follow-up, you don't have a benefit in terms of quality of life in those with restrictive salt consumption. And as you've seen here, you have also some conflicting data. Lower mortality and hospitalization in salt restriction in this study of Colin Ramirez. Another meta-analysis didn't show evidence of benefit or even harm. And finally, we don't have strong evidence, and the advice is to try to reduce salt consumption to less than 2.4 grams per day. What we have to remember finally is you have a positive curvilinear association of sodium intake and blood pressure, an increased risk of cardiovascular events when sodium intake exceeds 5 grams per day, and moderate sodium intakes is probably the best option because it is associated with lower cardiovascular risk compared to both high and low. This support, of course, the G curve, as I show you here. 3 to 5 is good, more than 5 is not good, and less than 3 is probably also harmful. So, the final question, as Hamlet, you have seen, should or should not, the question is probably between 3 and 5 grams per day. But we have little evidence that lowering sodium will reduce cardiovascular events or deaths below this range. And after or more than 5, especially for hypertensive patients, obese, of course, if you don't have orthostatic intolerance syndrome, it may be good. For heart failure, as you see here in the American guidelines, it is advised to lower sodium intakes, but remember that we don't have very strong evidence. So the take-home messages are we don't have very strong randomized trial. We don't have methods to accurately measure sodium intake in individuals. It was a weakness for most of the studies. And we have to avoid recommendation for specific gram per day sodium intake target for individuals. You have to provide advice on avoidance of sources of high sodium intakes, and in our modern world it is mainly the processed food. And we have also to recommend an overall dietary quality diet. And salt substitute, I didn't mention it a lot, but can be an option because we have some evidence that it can be useful. And we need to target at specific groups, mainly hypertensive subjects, those with metabolic syndromes. And for the community level, we just need to advise to lower sodium intake to 5 grams per day for those who have a high consumption of salt. Thank you.